Hello, writers of truth, writers of hard things, writers of lived experience, writers of what could just as easily be kept buried, and yet it can't and it won't be because it is calling. Yes, that is how it goes. And this is Memoir Nation. It is our summer mashup month. Happy August. We are plowing through it. And Grant, before we start, I have to say that I love and hate summer at the same time.
I have a lot of feelings about summer, Brooke.
I really do. I love it because it's full of promise for what can be, like travel, time off, summer excursions, all that good stuff. But it also is totally chaotic, out of routine, and bouncy. Like I do not feel grounded, and I am always playing catch up. And I am not sure if this gets better once your kids are out of the house, or if summer is just always this dream of relaxation and downtime, but in fact, really just chaos. So enlighten me.
Well, I'm actually finding most of life a dream of relaxation and downtime because my life just keeps getting more chaotic. So it's on the dream side.
I see. I've got you. It's a dream. I thought you were saying it was actually a dream of relaxation. And I was like, what world do you live in?
Yeah. What happened to you since I last saw you? Sorry, that was maybe misworded. But now that my kids are grown, honestly, I don't know how we did it. I can't add making lunches every morning and drop off some pickups to my schedule. So I guess you might say my routine is chaos itself. You know, it didn't get any better when I had to stop that. Mm-hmm. So I am here to found another organization with you, Brooke. It's called the Alliance of Chaotic People Who Just Want a Little Downtime. Are you in?
Oh, I'm in.
We need one more big project in our lives, I know.
I am in, though I am sad because it means that things are probably not going to calm down for me the minute James graduates from high school. Obviously, wishful thinking. But in the meantime, Grant, in August, we do this thing where we choose two former interviewees that we partner up because we see some connection between the two writers. And so here we are again. And in this time around, Andre Dubus III and Marya Hornbacher, like both of them are just such legacy writers. You know, like when I looked at the list, I was like, oh, they rose to the top for exactly that reason. Like they've both been doing what they've been doing for a really long time. In a lot of ways, they are household names in certain writing circles, like our writing circles. But also importantly, both have written books that have spared nothing, you know, and that really have come with certain costs. And I think it's an important thing to talk about because we always talk about memoir as risky and that we shouldn't pretend that it isn't. And I think that one of the things that makes it uniquely challenging is that, you know, because we are thinking about who we're writing about and who we're exposing and what the consequences will be. But of course, like thinking about all of those things can make you not want to write, you know, or at least not want to publish.
Yeah, definitely. And I like this topic a lot and looking at it through the lens of Andre and Marya's work because their costs are very different. In the case of Andre, he talks in his interview about writing about his siblings, specifically about his sister's trauma and his brother being taken advantage of by a teacher and what was his to share and what wasn't. And he grappled with the truth of what he needed to write and also the potential fallout. And so this was a really central part of our interview with him, in fact, as he processed what his considerations were, and you could feel how much he weighed all of that. With Marya, it was different because from her telling of it, her parents were on board. You know, she was really mostly exposing herself. But then because she was so young when Wasted came out, the media and the public were so hard on her and she was exploited. And she talks about how she and other women writers of her era were the sad girls, the traumatized girls, and how ultimately detrimental that was to her and to these other writers. And that's a very big cost post-publication of what can happen when you get attention that you weren't expecting and when everyone wants to put their own lens on your story. And I don't think too many of us, when we're writing our memoirs, even think about getting ahead of something like this because it's not something, you know, that we're actually expecting to happen, or at least I'm not.
Right. That is true. And I think it's fair to say it won't happen to most of us, but it could. And I think that the memoirists who get this kind of attention are also not expecting it. I mean, everybody wants their memoir to be a big hit, but most people aren't expecting it or they are, but it's like not actually living into what, you know, the fallout is going to be. And so like most people want their memoir to be beloved, obviously, like that's the number one thing. And so then it's really hard because there are these other outcomes where people are judging you, coming after you, projecting onto you. And for sure, Marya had all of that in spades just because she was a young woman. She was a thin and attractive woman. And then she'd shared these really hard things. And there was, this culture that basically wanted to blame her for sharing her truth. And there was this argument at the time that unfiltered confession could tip into something closer to a how-to guide. I actually didn't remember that, Grant. I had to go back and look at it. But there was all of this stuff that she just got so much flack for. And of course, it seems absurd by the standards of today, where kids are basically getting advice online for how to have an eating disorder. But, that was a real thing she had to deal with.
That's so interesting, Brooke, because when Marya taught a class for us this spring, there was a student who came on and said she loved Marya's book so much and that she'd also struggled with an eating disorder. And then she said, "I'm not saying your book gave me an eating disorder," to which Marya responded, "Yeah, no, they've been around a lot longer than me." And I thought that felt like a pretty practiced response. Like Marya is used to getting people coming after her with comments like these that maybe don't take into consideration what Marya's been through or the backlash that she faced.
Yeah, 100%. I thought that too, when I witnessed that. And I also thought it was a masterclass of how to deflect an unwanted comment, because that is something that memoirists need to be prepared for. Yet you want to say something smart at the same time, not like go home and be like, oh, I should have said something so much better than that. And we all do have to learn how to deflect without getting defensive or getting triggered. I mean, in that context, Marya was in front of, like 100 students. And honestly, I think that all memoirists should get media training, because once you write a memoir, you're like all of a sudden dealing with everybody else's opinions of you. And then sometimes those feelings just get very intense.
Oh my God. I'm thinking of the vitriol we saw online after Liz Gilbert published All the Way to the River. And that wasn't the first time she's gone through it.
Yeah.
There were people online that were basically saying she was the devil. And you saw from mild-mannered people the kinds of posts that you'd think would be reserved for the worst of our society, just because Liz dared to share her truth, that she had thoughts of killing her partner when she was at her sickest. And, is that a terrible confession? Yes, but also I thought it was very honest, and it read real on the page, and they'd come to a very low point, and Liz Gilbert did not, in fact, murder her late partner. It was just part of her, imagination of what she might like to do. And that is the purpose of memoir, to go deep into sides of ourselves that aren't necessarily admirable, but which others have surely experienced. So I think we have to applaud it when people go there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, seriously. I was so distraught by people's reactions to Liz's memoir. But what you see is that it's very personal. Like people basically want to own your story. You write about addiction and this person over here is an addict, and they're like, I own this space and you're awful for not talking about it this way or talking about it that way, times whatever subject matters you're writing into, right? And what this says is that memoir provokes, and memoir makes people have feelings, and it should make us have feelings, by the way. That's a good thing. But I also wanted to say during that time, and I think I did, like, people, geez, check your feelings. It's just a lot.
Yeah, and applying this cost question to Andre, it's not surprising at all that his cost seems to have been paid privately, inside the family rather than litigated in the press. And this tracks for women's versus men's memoir. If we're being honest, women are accused of oversharing, while when men overshare, they're usually acclaimed for having done so. And it does remind me of one of the biggest complaints my female friends have about parenting, which is that if a dad does the bare minimum, he's hailed as the super parent of the year for basically doing less than a mom does on a daily basis. Of course, that doesn't apply to me. Kidding. You didn't laugh, Brooke. In that episode, I bared my soul and my household inadequacies in our episode featuring Jordan Carlos and his memoir, Chore Play. And I felt like I overshared, but I probably got some cultural points just for reckoning with that. And I still haven't washed the dishes, or not enough. No, the unspoken different standards between what women can reveal and what men can reveal is just really interesting. And you see it act out on the political stage and in the workplace, of course. And in terms of memoir, women were the trailblazers of this genre as writers and readers. And I have to say that we would not be where we are as a culture without the Marya Hornbachers of the world. And her memoirs have literally saved lives. And I hope Jordan Carlos's memoir has saved marriages. My wife, Heather, was the one who read it before me, and it's been a great doorway into discussing all of our household duties, and with humor, except when it comes to cleaning the bathroom, which will be a fraught subject throughout time.
Well, we'll take it up next time I see you guys.
Yeah.
It's hilarious what you said about the dads, because of course I have seen that play out. And I think, maybe even here, or especially here in progressive Berkeley. But, it's a good thing to end on the difference between personal internal costs and then more public external costs, because both are real and both are very difficult. And you will run the risk of both or either by choosing to expose yourself in memoir. And then there's exposing others, which of course memoirists have real fears about. Andre Dubus has that line, and I keep coming back to that, that what happened on one side of the door belonged to his brother, and what happened on his side of the door belonged to him. And it's such a clean way of drawing a boundary that in practice or like in real life feels very messy. So I appreciate him for that.
Absolutely. What I love about memoir is that messiness. It brings us in touch with humanity, because lives are messy. People are messy. Things are not just one way. And people who are drawn to write memoir, I find, are willing to wrangle with the complexity of it all. And if you write memoir and read memoir, you can't really stay overly rigid in your thinking. It starts to break you open, because you see all these different ways of being, and you see that we are constantly facing choices and conflict and the stuff life just throws at us.
Well said, Grant. And that's what we've got for you all today, listeners. Thank you. If you are working on the parts of your story that involve someone else's door, go read Andre Dubus's Townie. And if you're working on the parts that live entirely in your own body, read Marya Hornbacher's Wasted. These are both fabulous books, and we feel incredibly humbled to have had these two legendary writers on Memoir Nation this year. So enjoy the clips, whether you are revisiting them or listening to them for the first time. Up first is Marya Hornbacher. Welcome, Marya. We're so pleased to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So I'm excited to talk with you because you've been writing memoir for a long time. Wasted was published in the late 90s when you were just 24 years old, and you were at the forefront of a movement, really. And you were so young and still recovering from the devastation of a very severe eating disorder. So could you talk about those early years, like when Wasted first came out, and a little bit about the circumstances that led to that first book?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And I think there are a couple pieces there. First, actually it came out when I was 23. And so by the time I was 24, I was like, I hate memoir. I hate publishing. I hate books. This is awful. And so part of the thing that was so interesting about that era was that the memoir as a form was really reshaping and finding its feet in a new way. So prior to that, what we now are refer to in retrospect as the memoir boom, part of that was a reframing of what stories mattered. And a lot of the pushback that we, quote unquote, the young women who were largely responsible for that memoir boom, or at least put into the forefront of that memoir boom, a lot of what we were arguing in some ways, whether haphazardly or intentionally, was that our stories matter, that women's stories matter specifically. And so if you think about where this was in the literary arc of things at that time, what I have come to call the mid-century male novel was still very much king in what was believed to be literature, what was called literature, real literature, high art. And the high art, low art argument was still very much alive and well. And so we were saying, our little lives count, right? And I think there is an extent to which now, 30 odd years later, we're going, do they though? Really? And so I think that question recycles itself over and over and over. And I do think it is incumbent upon people who write personal narrative, memoir and other forms of personal narrative, to know why we do this, why our stories matter, and why we're telling them in this way at this time. And so what I knew at that time was very little. I lived in a little, plywood apartment and thought, I think what I'll do is write a book about phenomenology and epistemology and media. Nobody thought that was a good idea except me. And so I had this very, very persuasive, I'd say, agent who was like, what we could do is make this a story about yourself. And I'm like, I can see weaving that in. Okay. But the book I thought I was selling when I sold Wasted was about phenomenology and embodiment and patriarchy and a lot of other things. But basically, I was a punk. I was like, this is cool theory. And what came out, of course, by the end of that was Wasted, and a memoir that was, yes, at the forefront of a boom of women's memoirs. And that has shifted and changed over time. But at that time, a lot of what we saw were a lot of train wreck white girls who were making publishers a whole lot of money. And that's what it is, but that's part of what it is. And so anyway, that answers a bunch of parts of that question, probably not all.
It did, and more. And there were 10 years between Wasted and Madness. And I have to say, I love the titles of your books. But you wrote a novel between these two memoirs, and it was your first and only novel. So I'm just very curious, because I'm a fiction writer to begin with. What did you discover about yourself from writing fiction? And then what brought you back to memoir?
My agent. So I love fiction and I love narrative. I mean, like, to me, life for me as a writer begins and ends with story. It really begins and ends with storytelling. I am not naturally a fragmented writer. I'm not naturally even a poet. I write poetry. I've won some poetry awards and I've got a book of poetry coming out. But ultimately, I begin and end at storytelling. And I cannot tell you how overjoyed I was to have the chance to not write about myself. When I started writing The Center of Winter, I'm like, get me out of this girl's head, right? And so again, that part of that is youth. Part of it is that the publishing industry, it's an industry, right? They're making a living, and I get that. But the reason that I returned to memoir was because the books that I wanted to write, were literary novels, right? I wanted to write literary novels. I wanted to write prose poetry. I wanted to write journalism, specifically, more than anything. In nonfiction, I wanted to write reported narrative nonfiction, which is ultimately what I get to do now. But at the time, the memoir, and even then when Madness came out, the mental health memoir was having a moment, as they say. And, this is not there's no one who is more or less responsible for these things, but I was having a hard time persuading anybody that they should let me write narrative nonfiction or novels. So I wrote The Center of Winter in great part, to teach myself to write a novel. And it's a disaster structurally. Like, Grant, it is a mess. Like, it is a structural catastrophe, but I really love it because I love the characters. I spent years with those characters, right? I spent years trying to teach myself to write a novel. The reason it took so long, in part, was because the novel I wanted to write, which was this little domestic drama about a small town suicide in the 60s, again, the market was not as psyched about that idea as I was. I really thought it was a cool story. I still think it's a cool story, but there was so much push and pull between what the market and its representatives really needed me to do, which was write a catastrophic disaster about more messed up girls. And I wouldn't do it, right? And I got in a heap of hot water for it. That was a mixed metaphor from hell, but I did. And it was really a catastrophe for my career at that time. And I was ultimately asked to return to memoir. And I did that. And I like Wasted and Madness well enough, but the direction my work has gone since has really shifted. And we'll get to that.
Yeah, well, back when you wrote Wasted, like you said, there were other women doing this. It was kind of a zeitgeisty moment. There were writers like Elizabeth Wurtzel and Caroline Knapp, and Elizabeth wrote about depression and Prozac Nation, and Caroline about alcoholism and drinking a love story. Both their books came out not that long before Wasted. I was just curious, did you know them, and to what extent were you aware of being part of this zeitgeist moment? It sounds like they drew you back in to write Madness in part because you were still writing that zeitgeist.
Yeah, the zeitgeist was a long zeitgeist. It's supposed to be faster. It's supposed to mean moment, like in German. It means a minute. Like, it doesn't mean a decade. Anyway, but yes, I met Liz Wurtzel a couple of times. I did not know Carolyn Knapp. She knew of me. I did not know when I sold Wasted accidentally, a memoir, which I'd never read either of those women's books. And the first memoir that I read and really, really loved, and I continue to feel that this is really one of the best memoirs, honestly, of the 20th century, 21st maybe, is Lucy Greeley's autobiography of a face, which was a brilliant book. So was Mary Carr's Liars Club. Mm-hmm. Like, to me, reading those is a delicious experience of storytelling. I thought Prozac Nation sucked. I'll tell you that. Like, that doesn't mean I don't like Elizabeth Wurtzel or like her. I liked her well enough, right? But what I saw, even when I read that, was that someone was capitalizing on Liz's grief. That troubled me. It still troubles me. And the fact that as many of those memoirists the women memoirists from that era, a bunch of them are dead, which seems curious to me. It seems really curious. And so one of the things that really I push back against around the idea of like the grief memoir or the trauma memoir, right? The trouble with it isn't that the story isn't important. It's that the story is profitable. And that has to be balanced, right? Against the value of the story, against the quality of the literature, right? Liz Wurtzel was a way better writer than Prozac Nation would have suggested. She really was. She was brilliant. She was gifted beyond all possible comprehension. And she was really, really exploited. She was. And so did I know her? I knew what it was doing to her. I saw what it was doing to her in both the media and in person. And there was this sort of horrible moment where the women memoirists were being pitted against one another as like, who's the latest sexy ingenue? And when I saw that happening, I'm like, you know what I'm not going to do? Write another memoir. So I went and wrote The Center of Winter. I'm not going to be topless on People magazine. You know what I mean? So it's not that that was bad. It's that we were so young and we were so vulnerable. And I don't mean we're like fragile victims. What I mean is that we were young and kind of stupid. There hadn't been a memoir boom. We hadn't watched a memoir boom eat each other alive yet because it was happening right then. And so did we have insight into it? Not at all. Not at all.
I'm going to shift briefly just to your class for Memoir Nation, which we're just so super excited about. And you're going to be teaching on the give a shit factor, which is, again, a great title. So I was wondering, can you tell us why it appeals to you to teach other memoirists about this and what you've learned from your own writing and publishing about how to make your readers care?
Yeah, I think the thing is, the reason I want to teach the give a shit factor, and I taught an early version of this a couple months ago, and we had so much fun. It was a huge success because we all really got a chance to think about what matters, not just to ourselves about the story, right? Our stories matter to us a priori, right? Like out of the gate. We all care about our own stories. But in terms of thinking about why a personal narrative matters to a reader, to me, it really comes back to that central question E.M. Forster raised. He wasn't writing about writing, but the line in Howard's End where he says, only connect, right? To me, that's the only valid writing advice. It's only connect, right? And so because our readers need to be broader as a population than just people who've also had our experiences, right? We can't just be telling people about their own stories, though I think that's a deeply important part of it. I think if we are only speaking to our own demographic, right? That's one of the reasons that women's memoir was white girls' memoir for a long time, right? Because it wasn't reaching past the specifics of the individual experience. So in the give a shit factor, what we're going to talk about is how do we make that connection? How do we build that bridge so that it's not merely I relate and it becomes this is resonant. This is a story that matters at this moment in time, not merely because I myself had it or because other writers like me had it, but because it matters to this world, right? And because it speaks to a current that goes beyond the individual. And that's really because to answer the question about like, why do I want to bring this to other memoirists? It's because I've never met a memoirist who didn't eventually say, this is bigger than me, right? Eventually we can all kind of trip upon what means something to someone else in our own stories. That's connecting the micro and the macro. And that really to me is the purpose of personal narrative of any kind. And so in teaching that to memoirists, it's not teaching them how to do it. It's teaching them like the need to find what is really crucial in connecting the individual story to the larger world. So to me, it's as much an ethical question as it is a craft question.
I love that. 3 cheers for that class because it's going to be so important. And I feel like, a lot of people need it. Yeah, exactly. So I read an interview you gave in 2022 to the Creative Independent. And in it, you're critical of your early work. You call it flawed. You call memoir a failed genre, which you later qualify as tapped. So we'll tread a little carefully here just because our listeners are a lot of them aspiring memoirists and you're teaching that class,
sure.
Which will hopefully help them be better memoirists. But it sounds like you were or are frustrated by the genre. And so what do you think that we can do as people teaching memoir and talking about memoir to better support memoirists, to do that, to be better memoirists and to tap into that universal?
Such a great question. And I think there's 2 pieces to this answer that I have. One is I would go back and say that, when I said it was a failed genre, 4 years ago and a tapped genre, I think what I am referring to, because I remember that interview very well, and Elle is a great friend. We have a call tomorrow, Elle Nash and I. And so I'm talking to her in that interview about the fact that at that moment, memoir had really, I felt, gone into a contracted place. It's now, I feel, expanding, right? So I feel like every genre contracts, expands. It's like doing what it should do on a broad scale, and then maybe it's not doing that for a minute. And so in that moment, 4 years is a long time in a publishing life, right? And so 4 years ago, I think we had gone to a really, really contracted, almost solipsistic place. Like, there's the question of, is memoir solipsistic inherently? I don't think so. I don't think writing is solipsistic inherently. I think it's actually quite the opposite. I think it is ultimately fundamentally generative. I think it is ultimately fundamentally a social form. And so when I saw memoir at that time doing what I saw it was doing, which I view was contracting, and pulling away from its responsibility to connect the individual to the larger world, now I do feel like it is moving beyond. And so what I think we can do as teachers and as memoirists ourselves is really recognize that it is first and foremost our task to offer readers doors into lives, right? Other lives. And in teaching memoir, or in maybe even just modeling memoir, what we can do is model, how do we reach the reader, reach out to the reader? You can't see me, but I'm gesturing, reaching my hand out and grabbing the readers, right? And so I think the really essential part of that is, I hear, and I think this is partly PR stuff, of people being like, it's time to tell your story. Your story matters. Well, yeah, your story matters. Yeah, sure. Good. But why does your story matter to a reader? Like, it's not just in the abstract. Why does your story matter to this reader specifically? How are you going to connect your experience with someone else's so that there is a resonance, so that you pluck a string and there's a hum, right? It doesn't have to be the same experience. It just has to connect in a way that is really, really taut and meaningful, because that's how the sound comes out. That's how the resonance occurs. And so I think in a tapped genre, in a moment, let's call it, a moment that was a little bit contracted, I want us now to be moving into a moment where personal narrative, first of all, is beyond just what somebody called the other day the memoir industrial complex, which cracked me up. He's a wonderful memoirist, fabulous journalist. My goal, right, as a person who is both a journalist and a memoirist, is to blend those, right? Like, I report on my life like a journalist, and I go into the world as a journalist with an eye from the subjective, right? And so to me, those are not mutually exclusive. And our ability to tap other forms of nonfiction is underutilized. And so I think that's another thing that we can do as modelers of memoir form. Is show people how to integrate forms of nonfiction and use every single craft element to the end of writing more meaningful, more impactful work.
It's interesting, Marya, is that in your answers, you've presented such an interesting, like, literary and cultural history of the memoir genre itself. And so I'm actually very curious about your sort of personal history within that, because you've taken a very unorthodox approach to writing. You know, like, after your memoirs, you went on to write for Hazelden, 2 self-help books. And it's interesting because the world measures writers' success, I think, by their books. And you even mentioned that 4 years is a long time in publishing. And yet over all these years, you've been writing essay and poetry and short stories, and you have a new book coming out. And it's not on the subject of mental health, but rather on travel, which is what your Substack's focus is. So I'm just wondering, can you talk a bit about how you see yourself as a writer?
Yes, I think what I would say more than anything else is that the trap of sameness kills careers. Like, right, you might make a lot of money writing the same thing over and over. As a reader, I don't care. If you wrote it right the first time, I don't need to read your same book again. I might read that book again because you did it right the first time, right? But as a writer, it has always been way more important to me to stretch myself intellectually and creatively and formally, right? And as a journalist, as a thinker, as a person, that's been way more important to me than to continue to make a profitable product. I'm aware that books become a product, right? I'm aware that audience is important, and I want to reach an audience, but my goal in reaching an audience, and my publisher and agent will be very crabby about this, but that's okay. They understand. I mean, they know me. So like, as my point actually isn't to sell books. My point is I will tell people, steal the books. Like, right. If you want to steal the books, steal the books. But like, I'm not making any money on this anyway, kids. So what I want is for readers to get the story they will resonate with. I want readers to access not just the story, but the form, right? Like some of my readers don't read memoir because they like my prose poetry. Sure, that's a smaller piece of the pie, but I better be writing for those readers if I can. Right? My journalism readers don't care about my personal experience all that much. And that's fine. That's why I'm writing in that form. Right? And so if I had wanted to just skyrocket to the top of the whatevers in one form, I would have probably tried to do that, but I've had no interest in doing that because that doesn't challenge me. And I also will say, I see myself fundamentally, even when we take me out of answering your question about how do I see myself as a writer, I see myself as an activist writer. I am not writing to be a famous writer, right? I'm writing to get a book to somebody that they need. That's way more important to me. And it makes a whole lot less money. And I don't care because it means something to that individual reader or that small group. I was at a poetry reading the other night. I don't know, there may be 100 people there. The energy in that Zoom room alone was magical. Like that's reason enough to write 27 poems. Go write beautiful poems and make a room come alive, right? And so I see myself as a person who can bring some life to a room. And I see myself as a person who can bring some light to issues that not everybody is willing to investigate because they aren't pretty all the time. And sometimes I'm trying to illuminate the intersection between the personal and the political, the private and the public, the individual and the cultural. Like those intersections to me are way more intriguing and ultimately more important than, I mean, nobody remembers who published your book. Like if they liked your book, they liked your book. And if they needed your book, well, you got lucky, right? Because you wrote something that meant something to someone else. And so I see myself as an activist.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. I can see that all the way. So I appreciate that answer so much. And I want to take us back to Wasted for a second, because at the end of the book, you contemplate your own mortality a bit. You do talk about how much damage you did to your body. And you talk to the reader straight on about the fact that they're not going to get any resolution. I really liked that straight talk, but it also struck me that you really thought you were going to die young. And in fact, in that book, you were half dead or nearly dead. And this may be pushing at the edges a bit, but I couldn't help but wonder, how being so close to death in the way that you were impacts how you've lived in the years since. And, that could be about the writing, of course, but like, has it made you harness things harder?
Such a great question and well put. Harness things. I think that is probably yes. I can answer that right off the top of my head. Yes. I think that, life is long. There are a few things that you don't know, like most things, maybe that you don't know when you're 22 and writing a book that's going to come out when you're 23. You don't know anything. I mean, I maybe knew how to change my tire, but really I did not know anything except what I had been given to believe. And I think this is something that's meaningful and probably for a later conversation when I have not the book that's coming out next solo, but the one after that really pushes back against the framework that I was absolutely using for both Wasted and Madness. Is I was a true believer in a very specific, and I will now say very narrow way of understanding the human mind, the fallibilities and the frailties and the strengths of the human mind. I really was, the idea of the tragic train wreck girl, though I did not see myself as tragic, I was fully prepared to see myself as a train wreck. And let me tell you what garbage I now think that is. And so I really did I think I was going to die? Yeah, because everybody told me I was going to die and I was a dingbat and I believed them because that made sense, right? Like that was the only framework I'd been given was like, you're sick, you're broken, we're here to fix you. The doctors in the nice white coats will give you pills and you'll be okay. At 51, I'm not dead. Right? Like I'm an old broad. I get to say whatever I want. That was garbage. I didn't die. And not only did I not die, I had to unlearn all of the learned helplessness that true believing created in me. And then I replicated in those books, which really troubles me. Do I think they're irresponsible? No. I knew what I knew when I knew it, right? But years down the line, I'm like, I see so clearly how that framework profited anyone but me and people in recovery, right? It profited anybody but the people trying to heal. And so now, as I'm going into the reporting on a book that's going to be about, big pharma, big psychiatry, right? Like the psychiatric industrial complex, as I report on that, and I'm now able to integrate true reporting with personal narrative, I will be coming right at that framework and the fallibility of it and the problematics of it. And I am not sad to say that it's going to get me in a lot of trouble. Fine. Good. There we are.
Well, Marya, since you mentioned your age, I want to bring that up again and weave it into this eternal question that every memoirist grapples with in some way. And that's like how their loved ones will react to their work. And, you were obviously so young, and you even said, what do you know at 22? And but you write really openly about your parents, especially. And so for people who worry about what their parents or their siblings or their children might think, can you share what insights you have on this front and maybe how you've grown over the years? And was there ever a fallout with your parents about anything you wrote?
No, not at all, because I interviewed them exhaustively. I was recorded. Like, we met for days on end. So everything that went into that book, first of all, as my mother has said to people later, like, people are like, oh, what do you do about this book? And she's like, dude, I lived it. The book is nothing. Like, this was awful. Like, the fact that she's not dead, great. They don't necessarily like everything I said, but they know it's true. So, like, at some point, as a reporter, as a person who is really fundamentally sees myself as a person who is trying at all times, not just to stick to the facts, but to nail those facts to the wall really firmly. It was very important to me when I wrote that book. And again, since I didn't know anything about memoir and the garbage about creative use of the facts, to shut up. You know what I mean? Like, we're not here. If you're writing fiction, write fiction, right? And call it fiction. I really struggle. I go back to Gay Tales's point about, nonfiction means it's not fiction. I know that lots of people come down on different points on this, but I am really like, if you have the facts, use the facts. Like, you do not need to change the facts. The facts are interesting enough. You know what's hard to believe? Reality. Like, that's the stuff is like, we have a much higher burden of proof in nonfiction. And so in interviewing my family, it meant everything to me that they were willing to be interviewed, and that I could back up everything that book and any book in which I quote family or friends. I can back it all up with the tapes. I can back it all up with the transcripts, right? So and at the same time, every book written in the first person acknowledges the limitation of subjectivity, right? So not only am I saying, okay, these are the facts, I'm also acknowledging, and this is how I put them together, right? Like, that is subjective. My takeaway, my sense of what meaning this has is subjective, flawed, limited. And I acknowledge that by writing in the first person. And so that to me is really an important acknowledgement. And so my parents were not surprised. There was no fallout. They read the book before it came out. They'd done all the interviews. And as my mom has said, it was much worse to live it than to read about it. And so, what I'd say to people about writing about family is, I mean, Anne Lamott's famous thing of like, if people hadn't want you to write about them, they would have been nicer to you. You know what I mean? They should have been. But like, a personal narrative isn't just, and it better not be just, oh, these bad people did these bad things to me. If that's where the draft is, and I've had clients with a draft in that shape where I've said, okay, you got this draft out. Now, what's your role? What did you do in this whole process? Because we are none of us passive victims. Right? We're just not. Like, we are in our position in the world, and we are influenced by factors. But my parents, my family, the people that I encountered in the world, I don't see any of them as the villain. And I hope I did not present them as such. And so, families are by definition a mess, and people are super tricky, and writing about people who are living is, to me, the best thing you can do, and perhaps the only thing you can do, is represent them as accurately and fairly. That does not mean that has to be complimentary, but it has to be fair. That fairness is more than anything what you are trying to do in representing not just family and friends, but other people, right? Well, we're not trying to cast villains. This is not slapstick noir comedy, right? This is life. Like, people are not this or that. They're often just muddling through. And that's what I can do, is represent people accurately and fairly. That's about all.
Yeah, indeed. Well, here's our last question for you, Marya. It's about catharsis. I mean, you make the point quite emphatically at the end of Wasted that the book was not cathartic for you, quite the opposite. And I wonder what your thoughts are now, nearly 30 years later. Is writing cathartic? Can it be? And what would you say to someone out there who's wanting to write a book about this, about the healing part of the process?
That's such a good point. I mean, like, to me, by definition, when we go back to Aristotle's Poetics, catharsis is the experience of the listener or the viewer or the reader, right? Like that, the catharsis is not for the artist. Catharsis is for the audience. That's why the art exists, right? So when in the Poetics, when we go back to Aristotle, the purpose of the comedy, the tragedy, all of these things are intended to give release, catharsis, to the reader, right? And so if in reading this book, I have a reader say, you told my story, or I didn't understand it before, or you brought me to somebody walked up to me after, actually, the wonderful, wonderful poet, C. Russell Price, came up to me years ago after a poetry reading, and he said, oh, I love this so much. He goes, oh, I just experienced such extraordinary catharsis listening to that piece. And I'm like, that is the best thing anyone has ever said to me after a reading. And now he's a really good friend and a fabulous writer, and I'm lucky to know him. But back when he was a student, he was identifying what I hoped as a writer to achieve, which is someone else's release, right? Someone else's artistic, emotional, spiritual experience. And so if I can facilitate that as the writer, that's me and catharsis. If in the process of writing, I am able to improve my life, become a better person, clean up my act, get my shit together, like, great. That's a side effect, maybe. And this is what I think is the side effect of it. And this is, I've taught this actually at Hazelden before. Applying the principles of narrative structure to one's own life really allow one to see, wow, you've got a whole lot of crisis in here and no resolve, right? And you've got a lot of villains and no nuance. So if we apply the principles of narrative craft to our lives, and I think this is where it can be healing to write a memoir about something troublesome, in putting it on the page, in externalizing it, in restructuring our lives, not revising them, but looking much more pragmatically and perhaps objectively at the moments in our lives. In the process of trying to make the mine ours, we can see our experiences and our behavior and our perceptions newly, more fairly, more accurately, and we can probably identify where in the narrative arc we screwed it up, and we can fix it. You know what I mean? And so I think in that regard, the process of writing a memoir can be healing insofar as it allows us to look over our shoulders, not with 20/20 hindsight, but to look back and go, oh man, you really messed that up, didn't you? You could do that differently now. And this is the last thing I'll say about that. It wasn't cathartic. I don't see that. I mean, something that has gone through who knows how many drafts, revisions, it's in 50 languages, whatever. Like, it's no longer raw. When people say your writing is so raw, I'm like, I assure you it is not. But what you do in the process of writing is reconstruct past, reconstruct history, reconstruct experience. And in that process, you can see the opportunity for change. And that, to me, probably is the healing effect of writing personal narrative.
And here's Andre Dubus III. I'm just going to go with Andre from here on out. Please. On the intro here, Andre, that you've been a finalist for the National Book Award, Guggenheim Fellowship, National Magazine Award for Fiction. I mean, it does go on and on. It's very impressive. Your books have been published in over 25 languages, and you teach at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. And today you're joining us. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Brooke. But I got to, for all my Lowell people, you got to know it's Lowell, Mass.
Oh, Lowell.
Yeah.
I know. I was just saying, I'm a SoCal girl and I don't have
it's okay. Kerouac Country, Irish Mickey Ward, guys like that. Where, by the way, my name wasn't Andre Dubus, but Andre Doofus or Dubus.
Of course. Easy to go there when you're a kid, I can imagine. Well, one of the things that you're routinely praised for is characterization across the genres that you write in. And since this is a podcast about memoir and memoir writing, I wonder if you can talk about how you approached characterization in Townie, and was it different than how you did it in your novels? And specifically, we do have a lot of writers on the podcast who listen to us. And so I'm just curious if you have insight for, people who want to pay more attention to how they're rendering their characters on the page.
Oh, my God, it's a great question. I believe I have 7 hours to answer. Is that correct?
About right. Masterclass.
Nothing is more important to me in fiction or creative nonfiction / memoir or personal essay in character. It is the only reason why I read literary fiction. And years ago, I had this kind of insomnia I still have, where I go to bed at 11 o'clock and I'm wide awake at 2 till 5. And so I'm watching PBS, and Mike Nichols, a great film director, is being interviewed. And the interviewer asks him, "What's the question, Mr. Nichols, that the storyteller asks before writing story?" He said, "Well, it's not the question the newspaper reporter asks. That question is, what happened?" And, the other W's, when, where, who. Not even why, that's analysis. But what Nichols said is, what we ask is not what happened, but what's it like, what's it really like to be in this thing that's happened? And I think that is so damn helpful. It's simple, but it's not easy. What's it like? What's it really like? As in, what's it truly like to be in this thing that's happened? So to answer your question, as I found myself writing my own accidental memoir that rose from an essay, I had no intention of writing a memoir, I was free with having to come up with what happened. It already happened. Now I'm going back in my memory to try to recreate what it was like. Again, for me, I think too many memoirists fall into this trap of thinking that they're their family biographer. Well, no, you're not your family biographer. You are singing your song, and we all know how fallible it is and malleable, and how it conflates with other memories. And to me, the most poignant fuel, it seems to me, for writing a memoir should be the part of the writer that knows what happens, but still doesn't know what the hell happened, right? And I know Uncle Joe went to prison when we were 12, but what the F was that about? And so you embrace that Nichols question. What's it like? What's it really like to be in this thing that's happened? And so you empty yourself of trying to say anything with your memoir. You empty yourself of trying to make sense of anything, even in your memoir. You let go of trying to rectify wrongs or prove people right. I think it's essential that the writer of the memoir steps back into total unknowing. One of my favorite lines from Rumi, the 12th century Sufi poet, is, "Sell your cleverness and purchase bewilderment." And let's look at the word to remember. We talk, in daily life, colloquial speech, we talk about, the opposite of remember is forget. I forgot where I put my keys. Oh, I remember where I put my keys. But you guys probably know the etymological opposite of remember is not forget. It's chop, 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 dismember. And so therefore the act of memory is reaching for the shards, reaching for the fragments. And it seems to me that the most honest approach then to creating character, which is the younger you, is to let go of everything the adult thinks she knows about herself then, because we're wrong. And I would argue too that it's that younger, whether this is a 12-year-old boy or a 20-year-old young woman, that's the one we have to give the mic to. In order to do it, we have to let go of all of our agenda, all of what we think we're trying to say or paint, and let the kid take over again from the fragments.
I guess I want to go to the body, because in memoir, of course, writers have to inhabit their own bodies. But in a given scene, you are the age that you were then, right? You're 10, you're 14, you're 22. And sometimes I think it's hard to remember how you felt or to put yourself back in that moment. And in fiction, of course, you can just make that up. And so I'm curious what your advice would be for people who struggle to remember or struggle with accuracy, and, what were some of the things that you did?
Well, I'll give you some tools that I find very helpful. My memory's pretty good with quotes, people's names. But if I see a movie tonight, you guys, it'll be a new movie come June, right? I'll forget I saw it. But so then I told someone that. I said, well, how can you write a memoir when you're going back 40 years? I said, well, if you're writing with authentic curiosity about your own life, right? If you're allowing yourself to actually be in a state of openness and bewilderment about what happened, if you let go of the fact that you think you actually know what happened, and then I'm so glad you mentioned that, Brooke. We write with the body, we live in the body. One of my favorite lines from writing is from Ron Carlson, the wonderful fiction writer, who said in one of his essays, "Details are for the writer only. They're the instruments by which we steer." Now, we know the first part of that line is hyperbole. We know that details will ultimately give the reader a feast. But we first have to give the writer a feast. So they are the instruments by which we steer. So there's a moment in my memoir, Tony, where I sat down to write that day. I write 5 days a week and take 2 days off, and that's how it's been for 42 years. And all I remembered, again, remember, the fragment was my brother Jeb and I sitting on the stoop of this rented house my mother could not afford, even though it was in the ghetto of this mill town. The windows were painted shut. We couldn't even open them. It was full of fleas and gnats. The stoop smelled like dried urine from the drunks who would stumble up from the barroom into the street and take a piss on our stoop. Twice they even opened the door of our unlocked house and pissed in the foyer. So that's all I had to work with was the smell of dried piss, but that triggered the smell too. There was also that sweet smell, which the older writer knew was the flaking paint of lead paint on the clapboards. And when I recorded those two smells with my pencil and my notebook, there came an image. And the memory was on one of those days sitting on those piss-smelling steps with my brother, Cody Perkins, whose real name is something else, and 2 or 3 guys saw us and started to chase us. This guy went on to become a prize fighter, died at 25 of a heroin overdose. He stole our bikes. He and his boys are really tough. They're probably 13 and 110 pounds, but they were big and tough for us at 10 and 11, wherever we were. So we run away from them down the street, across, past the biker hog bar place, into the lumber yard, past a forklift, up over plywood stack, over the chain link fence, into a weed lot, under a wharf, and where we hid for 2 hours. And my brother was picking broken glass up out of the mud, and I was looking out the river, and the Coast Guard was pulling a drowned man out of the river and into the boat. When I sat down to write that day, I had no memory of that drowned man ever. That was buried in my psyche. But the combination of authentic curiosity, don't assume you know, don't try to say anything, just try to find it. That combined with allowing the details to steer, right? Allowing the smells, the light, the sound, the weather to come in, it steers. It opens panels of memory, which opens other panels of memory and other panels of memory, and it's remarkable. And you'll notice, I've read, it's just like that in therapy. Therapists do the same thing. So where was your father sitting? On the couch. Was he still in his raincoat? Yeah. And that's when you smelled the blood? Yeah. They're doing the same thing, this reaching for the sharp, pull back and make the whole. It's really... And look, even if, in my experience, even when I was uncovering difficult material, painful memories, it was pleasurable artistically, because I felt that it wasn't bullshit, that I was uncovering something real. There's a lovely phrase from a psychoanalyst out of London his name is Dr. Bolus, and he's got this phrase, the unthought known. Isn't that gorgeous?
Danny Shapiro mentioned that when we interviewed her.
That's right. Well, that's where I learned it from. Danny's an old friend. And we talk about the unthought known, and then there's Grace Paley's great, we write what we don't know, we know. And this from some ancient Chinese anonymous poet, we poets knock upon the silence for an answering music. But I want to say something to that too, because now I've taught a lot of memoir classes and workshops, and I come across an understandable challenge with a lot of the writers with whom I work, and that is they want to say something. Say, no, you got to understand. You got to hear about my story. I grew up. My father's an alcoholic. My mother's a sex worker. Here's this is what it's all about. And look how I've turned out. And it's always, no matter how talented the writing, there's something flat and forced and still. And it's because I say it time and time again, and it's simple, but it's not easy. They are not curious enough about going back. You've got too much of an agenda, and it can lead to a one-note treatment of something quite mysterious and complicated.
Andre, it's like we worked together before this interview for you to kind of tee up my question here. So I want to talk about writing about others, because you often report events without assigning language that would kind of settle their meaning or assign judgment. For instance, you write about your brother's intimate relationship with his teacher without pausing to define or explain or adjudicate. And I'm curious, is this an ethical or a craft decision or both?
Grant, I am so grateful for that question. I have never been asked that question. Next question, please. No, I'm kidding. Great question. I think it's both. But I lean more towards the ethical part of it. Especially when it came to my dear brother's experience being sexually abused by a grown woman in our house for 6 years under my mother's nose. She knew about it. It was a real double standard. If it were a grown man and a young girl, it wouldn't have happened. So part of that was, for me, well, that's my brother's business. That's his story to tell. It's not my story to tell. But my story intersects with his. By the way, let me back up, and I'll finish that question because it's a great one, Grant, for which I'm grateful. You know, when I finished the first draft of this accidental memoir, I sent it to my editor, and she said, well, all this street fighting and violence is very interesting, but didn't you live with people? Well, your family, you've left your family out of it. I said, well, I don't want to violate their privacy. But isn't that part of your story too? I said, yeah, but, excuse me. And that night I happened to be at a dinner party, and Richard Russo is an old friend, and he and I were having our wine, and I told him what she said. And he gave me the most helpful advice, and I want to share it with the people who listen to your show and you, because it's so helpful. I said, I know she's right, but I don't know where the line is. And what wasn't I writing about? I wasn't writing about my sister being gang raped by men who were never caught. I wasn't writing about her selling drugs. I wasn't writing about my younger sister so depressed she put a padlock on her door and her heart. I wasn't writing about my brother's suicide attempts or sex abuse, on and on. And I wasn't writing about my father's profound absence or my mother's depression. And this is what Rick said. He said, well, if it were me, I'd ask myself one question. Am I trying to hurt anybody with this book? Am I trying to settle any scores? He said, if the answer is yes, I wouldn't write it, or I write it, but I wouldn't publish it. If the answer is no, I'd go ahead and write it. You guys, as soon as he said that, the anvil fell off my shoulders. You know, I was around 50 when I started writing that, and I was no longer angry at my parents. I had been earlier in my life, but I was no longer angry at their parents. I wasn't trying to settle any scores. I was just trying to capture what it was like to be this kid in this fatherless home, in this mill town, in the 70s, Vietnam limping to a finish, Watergate, drugs, sex too young, violence, on and on. So then I knew I could do it. But then I was going to bring in the family more. But then the strategy became, okay, I'm only going to write about my family's experience when it intersects with my own. So when I found out my sister had been raped, and this is in the memoir, I called my father, and it was the writing of that moment that brought me back to the truth, which was, I want to stick it in his face. Yeah, your daughter, my sister, got raped in Boston because she hangs out with a drug dealer, skanky drug dealer, who took her to Boston for drugs at 3 a.m. But I didn't know that until I wrote it. And so I think we have to be loyal to the truth, the subjective truth. But whose truth? The truth of the young person you're going back and giving the mic to. In that case, in that book, Tony, it was young me. My brother would have written a different book. In fact, he read it when it came out, and he said, well, you wrote the G-rated version of our lives. But back to the ethics. I love this line from Hemingway it's a famously quoted line from a letter to his editor, Maxwell Perkins, at Scribner's. But, he said, Max, the job of the writer is not to judge, but to seek to understand. And I found time and time again, especially with my fiction struggles, that if I have a moral stance on a character's behavior or even thoughts, he or she or they are going to walk away like anyone else you judge at a cocktail party. They're going to say, well, screw you, off I go. So I try very hard not to judge any character under my pencil. even if, I have a novel called Gone So Long and the main character killed his wife, I have such hatred towards male violence against women. I mean, those are the guys I used to hunt. And a character like that tugs on my sleeve to write his story. It was very difficult to suspend judgment, but I had to get into the private skin of that character. Let me say about that. I believe whether you're writing memoir or fiction, we're talking about memoir here. I think we have a sacred duty to these sacred beings called characters calling us back to the page. There's a reason why you're being called back to that time and that place, and you must follow. And it's terrifying. One of my favorite lines about fear, I think it's Henry David Thoreau. It could be some wise old woman in the Nepalese mountains, but if the mad dog comes at you, whistle for him.
Thanks for being with us, everyone. And we hope that your summer writing is going well and that you are getting a lot done. And if you're not, then you're waiting for September. That is great too, because we will be back in September with a whole new year-long new show lineup. And we're really excited about it. And we also have some offerings coming up, which include an 8-week intensive class, which is all about pitching and submitting, called Page to Pitch to Submit. And you can find that on memoirnation.com. And we are hosting a Pitchapalooza event on November 3rd. So we do hope that you will check that out. Also, you can RSVP for that at memoirnation.com. The Pitchapalooza event is free. It is open to the entire community. So go to our website and take a look and join us. And then we're also going to start getting ready for our second annual Jan Your Story in January. And yes, it seems far away, but it is such a cool thing. And we had so much fun last year, and it's going to be bigger and bolder. So mark your calendars for January. We're going to write 500 words every day in January together. I really hope that you're having a fun summer. Grant does too, of course.
I want to compliment you on your outro, Brooke. That was a wonderful outro. One of the best I've heard. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm taking a virtual bow. Come back ready to write, and we'll see you next week.